if you look at music notation, it's all graphic, starting with the numismus of the medieval time of the Middle Ages, going to the more specifically constructed notation in the Baroque era. And it was always the translation of the abstraction of what the composer had in mind, of what sound is supposed to be, to the manifestors of the sound, to the manifestation of the sound through a visual medium. And in the Baroque era, there was no specific instructions for tempo, for dynamics. It was up to the interpreter, and a fair amount of improvisation was always a strong part of it. I've always liked the notion of synesthesia. I've always liked the notion of the porosity of media, that you can't say, here's where sound exists, here's where light exists, here's where haptic acts exist. To me, there's a continuum. And to create graphic scores is very much acting on that continuum. A big moment for me was in terms of thinking about it, not in terms of doing it, but in terms of conceptualizing it, came from reading Walter Benjamin's text on the task of the translator. He was translating poems of Baudelaire into German. And what he realized, and what he talks about in this essay, is that the idea is not to get the words correct. The words only carry a small part of it, but to get the larger essence of what the work is. And so for a composer to create a score, you have a certain idealized notion, a Platonic ideal of sound in what I would call the source of creativity, the inner ear where the impulse originates. And your task is to translate that to the proper medium. Maybe it requires that you make a score, a written score to give to musicians. Maybe it requires that you just pick up an instrument yourself and play it. Maybe it requires that you have a very, very detailed score in it, like a typical classical composer would make, that you give to musicians who follow the instructions specifically. Maybe it means you don't make music at all. Maybe you make a piece of visual art. Maybe you cook a meal. Maybe you take a walk. Maybe you do nothing. These are all valid responses to the creative impulse. But what I'm thinking of specifically is why I make graphic notation. I spend a fair amount of time with an instrument in my hand, making sound directly, translating that in that way. I spend a fair amount of time making specifically notated scores for musicians to play as closely as I can hope. But I also like the visual realm, and I like the ambiguity of superimposing the visual realm with the sonic realm. When scores of mine are performed that are animated, scores such as Foliage and Silva Silvarum, and the sound you were hearing in the background when you came in was a performance of the Klang Ensemble in Padua in 2012, performing Foliage. There's an ambiguity. Are the musicians reading the score and producing the requisite sounds? Are the musicians somehow creating the visual element? Or are the musicians playing a soundtrack to a movie that's being shown? And I like that question to exist when someone watches a graphic score being performed.
I always had this idea about the past of music, whereas it's very recent that you can record music and keep it. With respect to the other arts, recording music is very new. Up until the advent of your first portable tape recorders, when you did a piece of music, it disappeared.
Well, the Edison cylinder.
So people had to write it down. They had to make graphics, right? But what would have happened in the history of painting if whenever you painted a painting, then the ink, the paint all disappeared after 10 minutes?
And certainly the art market would never have.
But it's interesting, this thing of the graphics was a common, universal language of some kind.
Or imagine the only way to convey what was on a painting if someone sang about it.
Right, tell the stories. It is a bunch of yellow up in the left. You had to write a bunch of instructions for it, right?
Exactly.
Which is what we're always doing here, instructions of some kind. But I'm curious about, like, actually on a practical level. I'm wondering, how am I supposed to approach this?
Well, there are a number of ways to approach a graphic score. And in fact, in speaking to that, I want to go back in history to the early 1970s. Steve and I were in university together at Bard College. And there was a jazz ensemble and a class led by the great trombonist and composer Roswell Rudd, who sadly just passed away recently. And the kind of operative paradigm at that time was free jazz, which was a very macho activity. Who played fastest and loudest, kind of controlled the direction of the music. And in thinking about it, I was trying to make some graphic elements. They were very naive when I look back at them, using colors and a timeline. And it met with not such a great response. I mean, you weren't there at the class when I brought it in, or one of the evening sessions.
Otherwise, there would have been a great response.
At least from one corner of it. But the idea never left me. And after graduation, we were all living in a house in the Upper Hudson. Steve and his wife at the time, and the saxophonist John Lurie, and the pianist Evan Lurie. Later, the three of them went on to form the Lounge Lizards. It was quite an interesting house. And we spent a lot of time on that back porch. There were thousands of fire. Does everybody speak English? Does everybody understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Good, because if I had to deliver it in Italian, it would be terrible. But we would look at the fireflies, and the idea was, well, what if at some moment, like the chimpanzees with the typewriters producing the entire works of Shakespeare, what if the fireflies were to suddenly present a coherent painting or a set of music on a staff, or a set of words, greetings from, And this gave me the notion to create a score. I ended up finding in a National Geographic a picture of some fireflies. I made a photocopy of it, and I superimposed it on some music manuscript. And this was a composition of sorts. I was experimenting with the idea of producing algorithmic compositions, the idea that all you really needed, and this came from a background I had in computer programming when I was a young science geek before I finished high school. And our Boy Scout troop was sponsored by IBM, and one of the programmers there, he said that the ideal was to create a line of code so dense and so powerful that you only needed this one line of code to generate a vastly complex manifestation. It was, a very nice utopian idea. And Benoit Mandelbrot realized this somewhat with fractal geometry. So these Hudson River compositions were a set of phrases, sometimes musical phrases, sometimes conceptual ideas, and sometimes visual. One was of birds, again, a photocopy of birds superimposed on manuscript. One was of a piece of a topological map of the Hudson Valley, where we lived, again, superimposed on some manuscript and used as a basis of a score. When I give a graphic score to musicians, I usually don't tell them how to interpret it, because the notion of interpretation is a very collaborative act. You're entering into an agreement with the performers, and part of that is working with performers that you trust, that perhaps you have some relationship with, that you have this transaction that they will take your words and do kind of the best faith interpretation of them, in the same way that you wouldn't give them this openness if you didn't know that they would do the best that they could with it. When I'm working with students, when I'm doing workshops, of course, then I might say, how do you interpret a score like this? I found working with young musicians, most of whom know what sound looks like, most of them do graphic editing in their computers or in their iPads to edit a sound, to make loops, and to see what a sound spectrum looks like. And they might see something like this and say, oh, well, this represents a certain density of sound over a certain frequency range in time. I have some scores that very specifically use sine wave modulation or square wave modulation. And in fact, I'll backtrack. Now, my approach to lecturing is always creative digression. So we'll digress back in time again. And in the early 2000s, when software was becoming powerful enough that you could use a small portable computer to process sound, that especially interfaced with hardware processors, I was doing a lot of mixing of live sound of musicians. I might give a score to a string quartet or a pianist and then mix them with my laptop. The sound would come out of the speakers. You'd have an electroacoustic component combined with the acoustic component. And this was very exciting because there were many sounds that it wasn't possible to make before. But at a certain point, I found my ears becoming fatigued by the sound of the speakers. And what I wanted was to hear just the acoustic instruments produce these other sounds and other timbres. And the question was, what kind of strategy? Musicians have used extended techniques, what some people call tricks, ever since instruments were invented, sometimes to produce onomatopoeic sounds, to imitate birds or flowing water. And this all seemed to be part of the continuum of instrumental technique. So I wanted to find a way to translate specifically what I was hearing to these musicians. And so what I did for a piece in 2006 was take the notation that I was working with in the computer and export it as a TIFF, as a graphic file. And I brought it into Photoshop and then applied the same processes to this music notation that I was using with live sound. I would filter, I would modulate using various waveforms, I would reverse, I would layer, I would use feedback. And this is essentially what you're seeing here, these same processes applied to a piece of music notation. The results I had from that first piece in 2006, which was called Sees, Seen. And the musicians I was working with, the Serious String Quartet, were very open and took right to it and produced sounds that I felt were very much in resonance with what I was imagining that the sounds would be from what I was producing with the imagery.
The images in a computer program are analytical. The louder the sound, the bigger they get, the longer the envelope, the longer the waveform. But at the same time, they're insanely arbitrary.
Yeah, well,
They're
always.
Invented there and pasted on to represent something, just like when they tell you you can hear the sound of the moon in orbit, but you don't really. You're hearing a translation of something into an arbitrary form. But the funny thing, I think, is you put sounds into the computer. They come out of the computer as this shape. Then you say, I'm sick of listening to the computer, I want musicians to play it. You give them something from the computer and you throw the computer away.
Yeah, it's like having a pencil.
Yeah.
But the thing is, these sounds start as an abstraction, because when I'm notating, I'm not putting sounds into the computer. When I'm writing music, I'm really translating, going directly from what I hear internally to how it's represented. Maybe it's a C, maybe it's a cluster of sounds, maybe it's a rhythm. So what I'm doing is taking notation, which is, again, a Platonic ideal of a musical representation. But then I'm imagining how these sounds could be presented in time by musicians. For example, in this piece, which is the latest piece, each of these cells was created from the same piece of music, one page of music. And you can see the kind of contours and how they match from page to page. And one may look at it as an ensemble piece. Sometimes I'm writing a score like this and it's for a group of musicians I might assemble, and I would tell them, each of you take a portion of this page and then follow it linearly, as if we're looking at it in time. Or imagine, now especially with ones like this, imagine you're staring at the sun and you're seeing the spots in your eyes, and then imagine it as you move your head, the spots also move. They're stretched in time. Imagine that as your score. What you're seeing from this kind of invasive interruption of your vision to the production of the sound of it. You know, I see these as abstractions, and because these operate as much as retinal art as a music score, again, that ambiguity or the porosity comes into play.
But when you're working with musicians who have to interpret this, do you find a big difference between, one, just asking them to improvise for you based on an idea or thought, and two,
Absolutely.
it changes a lot the way they do it?
Well, see, the thing is, graphic notation is tricky because at its worst, or like at its lowest, I'd say you put a pretty picture in front of someone and
Say do something
yeah,
pretty.
yeah, or ugly or whatever, you know. But it's just a pretty. But the fact is, anything that interrupts the pathway is going to affect it. Whether one can say there's a linear correspondence between this type of input to this type of output, I don't know. But if you ask someone to follow a score, now you could even take a piece of Baroque music that a musician knows very well, and if you ask them to keep the score in front of them, they're going to play it differently than if they play it from memory.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, so that the visual element is always part of the entire input-output feedback loop that we have to deal with as musicians, whether we're dealing with a purely auditory feedback loop or having to do with external factors or just interfacing with a score on a page or a score that's projected as a movie. The question is there any objectivity in musical interpretation? I mean, if you're playing Bach and playing exactly the notes that are there on the paper, even that is open to interpretation because they are left without specific instructions to many.
Yeah.
You know, when Pierre Boulez in the structures for piano serialized every single aspect of the score. He just used a bunch of number series to determine every single action of the musician. And if you compare it to a Xenakis piece that used completely stochastic processes, just random clouds of information to notate the music for the pianist, and you listen to the two pieces, they sound pretty much identical. There's the same amount of information or the same amount of entropy in them. So I think what you have to do to be successful as an interpreter is negotiate a balance between your input, your output, your own personality, and what is the external input coming from the score or the instructions or some ideal that you may have in your inner ear about the music you want to make. You know, I see it. I mean, that's the beauty of music making by a human being, is that it is interpretive. You know, it's erratum or errata. You know, we used to joke as improvisers, well, if you make a mistake, you play it again.
Do it twice, yeah. And the name of this, I think, kind of goes together with this. It's called Syzygy, which exists in Italian. Syzygy, it's a very old word. It goes way back to classical times. And in poetry, it means all the repetitions and interconnections of sounds that go beyond alliteration. Alliteration is when you say PowerPoint project, the words all begin with the same letter. In Syzygy, these matching letters get all intertwined together, which is really a lot like this image, because if I was going to play an instrument and look at this image, I would definitely find myself thinking, there's material, there's space, and this material has to be continuously reprocessed inside this space. That's pretty concrete.
And it also has to do with opposition. The astronomical definition of syzygy is when the Earth and the Sun are in the same plane so that they form, that's when you see the full moon. And the idea of opposition I took as a way of generating material. You may notice that a lot of the images come from taking the negative of the previous one, and are also playing with extreme contrasts and extreme contours of light so that you develop a depth. The original conception of this piece, you rendered it not on paper, which I'm very happy to see here, but it was rendered on acetate. It's at a gallery called Artaxen in Munich. We had the opening last night. And each of the pieces is divided into three, and they're layered to form a palimpsest. And as you look at it with a light behind it, then it reveals these kind of depths of motion and depths of opposition. And for the musician, of course, it's quite open. You might see it as a set of transformations in time. One of the things I was thinking about as I was making this was Duchamp's New Descending a Staircase, because it is that manifestation of time, of an image in time rather than fixed.
Especially if you had them in
Exactly.
that overlapping arrangement.
The thing about a graphic score ultimately is what it sounds like. Again, going back to our college days, we had this professor, Benjamin Boretz, who was very much at that time out of the Columbia, Princeton, serialized Milton Babbitt School of Music. And he would bring a computer printout to class, and he would say, "This is the best piece of music I've ever written." And someone would ask, "Well, what does it sound like, Ben?" And he'd laugh and say, "Well, that doesn't matter." and really, that's not how, certainly not what I believe. The question is, you enter into a relationship with the interpreter of the music, and you want them to make the sound that is the right sound for the image. Of course, what that right sound is may change from day to day, from moment to moment. It's a dynamic process. It's never fixed when you have music that is presented this way. If I want something very specific, then I notate it very specifically. When you work with an orchestra, like if you're working with a radio orchestra in Germany, you don't give them something like this. They would throw it down in disgust and walk out. You want to give them little black dots in exactly the right place, then they do exactly what you want. And you can get some fantastic effects that way. I think of the classical orchestra as a synthesizer with an operating system written in the 17th century. And you have to be able to code in that language. And if you can get great results. But they're not going to meet you halfway, and they're not going to be open to something like this. When I do it in workshops, of course, the first manifestation might be really literal, or might be very, they're so terrified at the notion of playing something badly that you feel that they're not giving anything of themselves. But, again, it's a process of collaboration, which is what makes it bigger than the sum of the parts.